Hello everybody, in today's video I'm going to be ranking the OEM 450s from worst to best. Now quick disclaimer before we start, this is my own personal opinion. Doesn't mean that any bikes are good or bad, it's just what I think. Okay, so in 9th place we have the TM450. Now this bike for me felt very light and airy. It almost felt like riding on a cloud, and it was very smooth, but I feel like it was almost too smooth. This bike just really felt like it had no traction. Every time I hit the gas and I was on acceleration, the back tire was just spinning out and I could barely get up to speed. So I didn't really like this bike for the fact that it had no traction, and it felt almost like you're riding on gravel, and it was kind of just spinning out a lot, and it kept on going flat in the corners and I just fall straight on my face. Alright, so in 8th place we have the Fantic XXF 450. Now this bike had a lot of power. It was kind of a rocket, but because of the power, it kind of was uncontrollable. Whenever coming into the corners and whatnot, I would really oversteer, and it was really weird because this thing has a lot of steering power, but it really liked to oversteer a whole lot. So if you really mastered this bike, it would probably be a very fast bike, but I have not mastered it and it is just too powerful for me. So I really do just oversteer in the corners and just go flying. It's kind of a rocket ship. So nice bike, but I feel like it's too uncontrollable, especially for a beginner. So I don't really like this bike. Okay, so next up we have the Honda CRF 450. Okay, so I have a lot to say about this bike, but the sound is really what stood out to me when I first started riding this thing. It sounds very deep and I love it. Okay, so in the info of this bike, it's actually a very light bike compared to the rest of the 450s, but when I was driving it, it really felt very heavy to me. I don't know why. It was really kind of pushing to the outside going around the corners, and it just felt super heavy. But it also felt very planted in the dirt, and it had a lot of acceleration, which in my opinion means that this bike has a lot of potential, but I just really couldn't master it. It was very hard to warm up on, and it was very hard to get used to. It's one of those bikes that they're kind of like bad when you're not used to them, but once you get used to them, you can really go crazy on it. Now the only other thing that I really noticed with this bike is that it had a lot of engine brake. Every single time I let off the gas, it felt like I was actually hitting the brakes, and it was kind of annoying to me because I really could not let it go of the gas, and I kind of had to keep it pinned. Now of course you can't really fix that, but most of these other things in these bikes are really fixable with the setup, you know, like the weight feeling of it. Of course it is a light bike, so since it feels heavy, I could probably fix that with the suspension setup, and anything that's accelerating too quick or not quick enough, you can really fix with gearing. Lots of these things are fixable with the setup. This is just the stock bikes in their stock form. Now real quick before we continue, if you guys are liking this video, make sure to hit the like button, and if you want more MX Bikes content, make sure to subscribe. Okay, so next up in 6th place we have the Kawasaki KX450. Okay, so there's not too much to say about this bike. It did have a pretty decent amount of power, but there was a few times where the bottom of the bike slipped out from underneath me, and I also hit a jump kind of funny the one time where the bike jumped it kind of funny. So it was doing a bit of funny things, but it was all around just kind of, you know, normal 450. This was really just a good bike, but there was nothing special about it, and that's why it's in 6th place. Now in 5th place we have the Gas. This bike was very front end high and it really liked to wheelie, but it was pretty stable when the front end was high. Now power wise, this bike had a very smooth power curve, and it did also have a lot of acceleration in that it was very similar to the YZ, but it kind of just bogged a bit more and it lacked a bit of low end power. Now similar to the power, this bike also cornered very smooth. So I did like the cornering in the fact that it was smooth, but I felt like it kind of understeered and it really liked to throw me over the berm. So I'd say that this bike is overall really smooth, but a bit too underpowered on the low end and kind of corners pretty bad. So I put this bike in 5th just because it's smooth, but that's it. There's nothing really else to it. Okay, so now we got the Suzuki RMZ450. This bike had a lot of acceleration. It really got up to speed and hit that red line super quick. The only real drawback to this bike was that I did find that it was pretty bouncy and it was a little bit unstable, but I think that it was a very fun bike and the acceleration was really kind of unexpected. Whenever I was going around the corner, the RPMs were so low that I thought I would really not have much power to make the jump coming up, but then the acceleration would just hit in and I would go flying on the jump, and I really did like that about this bike. Now this bike is kind of underpowered. It has about 6 horsepower less than most of the other 450s, and it's really noticeable once you get up to high speeds, and the top speed just really isn't as great as the other 450s. I have heard people say that this bike is not competitive and you can't competitive race this thing, but Trojan, he loves this bike. He's always riding it. He's got a nice suspension for it. I always see his videos and he's always ripping this thing around, and he does pretty good in pro races. So I think this thing is competitive. It's just not as much top end as the other bikes. All around a great bike, very, very fun to ride, but just doesn't have as much top speed. Now in 3rd place, we have the KTM 450 SXF. Now this bike is very front end high, and I was really struggling trying to keep it from looping out, as just every single time I hit the gas, the front end would go really high up in the air and it would really, and I kind of had to lean forward quite a bit to counter that. This bike did have quite a bit of power, and I did like it in the fact that it had a lot of power all around. It had some bottom end, it had lots of top end, so I wouldn't really say it's smooth. It just had a lot of power no matter where you are in the RPM. This bike also cornered very smooth, but I found just like the gas, it kind of tended to go and understeer a bit and kind of throw me over the berm, but it wasn't as bad as the gas, but it was definitely noticeable. So that wasn't really my favorite thing about this bike, but it's not a bad bike overall. It's a good bike, but it can be better. Now in 2nd place, we have the Husqvarna FC450. I really loved this bike. It had a very smooth power curve, and although it did bog a bit and it was a bit underpowered, it was just all around very smooth on the throttle. Now the only really big issue that I had with this bike is that it kind of took corners too smoothly, and it really did like to go to the outside like a few of these other bikes did, and of course that's probably fixable with a setup. You know, you do a suspension setup and you'll be able to fix that, but in its stock form out of the box, I really did find that I didn't really like how smooth it was in the corners, but I think it really makes up with that because it is so easy to ride. It's kind of one of those bikes that you get on and you're just immediately smooth with it. You're just immediately clearing these jumps so smoothly, taking the corner so smoothly. It's pretty stable on bumps and jumps, and I really did like this bike because of that, because it's so easy, especially for beginners. Now finally, for my favorite bike in this game, it is a YZ450F. I just love this bike. This bike had so much low end power, and I really loved it about this bike. When you were on the low end, when you had low RPMs, this bike just had so much power to give. Now this bike might not have the most power in the top end in comparison with the other 450s, but I really do feel like it makes up with that with all of the bottom end power that it had. I find that this bike really did like to pull out of corners. It was quite a bit front end high, but when you were going around the corners and you would pin it, it would really just pull out of the corners really good because of that low end power. So I put this bike in the top spot, number 1, because of all the low end power, and also because it did have a pretty good amount of top end speed. So really it was good for all ranges of players. You know, it's great for beginners, it's also great for pros. Like anyone who plays this game, they can go out on this bike and they can ride it smooth, and it's got plenty of power for everyone. Now that is everything I have to say. Make sure to comment which 450 is your favorite. I hope you guys liked the video. See you in a later video. Goodbye.